The crowd gathered on Fifth Avenue that morning, their phones raised to capture what they thought would be just another viral moment. But this was different. A well-dressed elderly man lay sprawled on the cold sidewalk, his expensive suit collecting dirt, his silver briefcase thrown open beside him. While busy New Yorkers walked past, some even stepping over him, an unexpected hero emerged from the shadows. A small figure pushed through the crowd. His oversized, torn jacket dragged on the ground, his bare feet black with city grime. He couldn't have been more than 12. The homeless boy everyone usually ignored was now the only one moving towards the fallen man. "Someone call 911, the boy shouted, his voice carrying authority that seemed beyond his years. He knelt beside the unconscious millionaire, checking his pulse just like a trained medical professional. The crowd whispered and pointed, but no one stepped forward to help. The boy loosened the man's tie and placed him in the recovery position, his small hands moving with surprising confidence. The millionaire's breathing was shallow, his face pale as paper. When the sirens finally echoed in the distance, the boy leaned close to the man's ear and whispered something that made the few people close enough to hear gasp in disbelief. As the paramedics rushed forward with their equipment, the boy stood up slowly. His eyes never left the millionaire's face. Then, in a clear voice that cut through the morning air, he asked a question that would change both their lives forever. "Don't you remember the promise you made in room 437? The crowd fell silent. The paramedics paused. And somewhere in the millionaire's unconscious mind, a long-buried memory began to stir. The homeless boy stood there, waiting for an answer that wouldn't come today. But he knew, this was just the beginning of a story that would shock everyone who thought they knew the truth about kindness, promises, and second chances. End of part 1. This opening hook introduces the main incident, creates mystery around room 437, and sets up questions that will keep readers engaged. Who is this knowledgeable homeless boy? What happened in room 437? What promise was made? How does he know the millionaire? The next parts will gradually reveal these answers while maintaining suspense. Robert Parker hadn't always walked Fifth Avenue in $1,000 suits. 30 years ago, he'd been just another dreamer with big plans and empty pockets. But now, at 67, he was one of New York's most successful real estate developers, known for turning struggling properties into gold mines. Every morning, he followed the same routine. Up at 5 a.m., black coffee in his favorite mug, chipped on the rim but he refused to replace it, and the morning paper delivered by the doorman of his penthouse apartment. That morning had started no differently. He'd straightened his tie in the mirror, barely noticing how his hands shook slightly or how the shadows under his eyes had deepened over the past months. The cleaning lady had quit last week, the third one this year. "Too many rooms, too much silence," she'd said. Robert couldn't argue with that. His penthouse took up the entire top floor of the building he owned, but he only used 3 rooms, his bedroom, his home office, and the kitchen. The rest gathered dust, like the family photos he'd stopped putting up years ago. His doctor had been warning him for months. "Your blood pressure is through the roof, Mr. Parker. You need to slow down." But Robert always gave the same answer: "The business needs me." The truth was, the business was all he had left. His wife Helen had passed away 15 years ago, and their only son, well, that was a wound he kept buried deep. That morning, his secretary had called about the Thompson deal, another struggling hotel that needed his magic touch. As he'd walked to the office, his mind had been on the numbers, the contracts, the meetings ahead. He hadn't noticed how the morning sun made his vision blur, or how the pressure in his chest had been building with each step. The memories that haunted him most came from the old City General Hospital. Room 437 had been on the 4th floor, overlooking the hospital's small garden. He'd made a promise there once, a promise he'd tried to forget. Lately, though, it had been creeping back into his dreams, along with faces from the past he thought he'd left behind. His employees called him the Stone Man behind his back. Not because he was cruel, he paid well and ran an honest business. But something had hardened in him over the years. The young man who'd once given away his last dollar to a stranger was buried under decades of boardroom battles and lonely nights. That morning, as he'd stepped out of his building, the doorman had tried to tell him something about his color, about maybe calling a car instead of walking. But Robert Parker hadn't built his empire by listening to other people's warnings. He'd straightened his shoulders, gripped his briefcase tighter, and stepped onto the sidewalk for what would turn out to be the walk that changed everything. He hadn't felt the first signs of trouble, the slight numbness in his left arm, the way the world seemed to tilt sideways. By the time his knees buckled and the sidewalk rushed up to meet him, it was too late for regrets. His last thought before everything went dark was of room 437, and of a promise he'd tried so hard to forget. The briefcase that split open when it hit the ground contained more than just contracts and business papers. Hidden in a secret compartment was an old, worn photograph, a reminder of the life he'd had before success had filled his bank account but emptied everything else. Perhaps it was fate that on this morning, of all mornings, that photograph would spill out onto the sidewalk, right in front of a boy who knew exactly what it meant. Life on the streets had taught Tommy more than any classroom ever could. At 12 years old, he knew every alley, every doorway, and every kind person who might spare a sandwich in the 20 blocks he called home. He'd learned which restaurants threw away good food, which security guards would let you sleep in their doorways on cold nights, and most importantly, how to become invisible when the wrong people came looking. He hadn't always lived this way. 6 months ago, he'd had a home, a bed, and a grandmother who made the world's best chicken soup. But after she'd gotten sick and the hospital bills ate up everything they had, the system had tried to place him in a foster home. Tommy had other plans. He carried his grandmother's last words with him like a shield: "Sometimes angels wear rags, little one. And sometimes they have work to do." The other street kids called him Doc, not because he was sick, but because he spent every free moment reading discarded medical books from the hospital dumpster. While they played with broken toys, Tommy memorized symptoms, treatments, and emergency procedures. The old nurse who snuck him sandwiches in the hospital cafeteria would quiz him sometimes, amazed at how much he remembered. His spot near Fifth Avenue wasn't the safest or the most comfortable, but it was close to City General Hospital. Every morning, he'd watch the doctors and nurses hurry in, imagining himself in a white coat someday. The other homeless folks thought he was crazy, holding on to dreams that big. But Tommy knew something they didn't: he had a promise to keep. The cardboard box where he kept his treasures held only 3 things: a worn photo of his grandmother, a folded piece of paper with an address written in shaky handwriting, and a newspaper clipping about a local millionaire. Every night, before curling up in his hidden corner, he'd take out these items and remind himself why he stayed in this part of town, even when warmer places called. The regular people who passed him on the street saw what they expected to see: just another homeless kid. They didn't notice how clean his hands stayed, or how he studied their faces as if searching for someone. They didn't see him helping injured pigeons, or notice how he'd memorized the schedule of every ambulance that came and went from the hospital. That morning had started like any other. Tommy had washed up in the public bathroom, carefully folded his grandmother's old scarf, the only thing he had left of her, and taken up his usual watching spot. He'd seen Mr. Parker walking down the street every day for months, watching as the older man's face grew paler, his steps less steady. As a student of medical symptoms, Tommy had noticed what everyone else missed: the slight sway in his walk, the occasional grabbing at his left arm, the shortness of breath. When the collapse finally came, Tommy wasn't surprised. He'd been preparing for this moment, though not quite the way others might think. The address on that folded paper in his box matched the business card that fell from the millionaire's open briefcase. And the newspaper clipping? It told a story about a young businessman who'd once made a promise in room 437, a promise that would soon come due. As he'd rushed forward to help, Tommy wasn't thinking about being a hero. He was thinking about his grandmother's words, about angels in rags, and about a debt that had waited 15 years to be repaid. The question he'd asked wasn't just about a room number, it was about redemption, second chances, and the kind of promises that change lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue when Robert Parker's knees buckled. The sound of his briefcase hitting the concrete echoed like a gunshot, scattering papers and photos across the dirty sidewalk. Business people swerved around his fallen body, some glancing at their watches, others lifting their phones to record what they thought would be another viral city moment. Tommy moved with the speed and purpose of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in his head. "Give him space," he shouted, his young voice carrying an authority that made even suited executives step back. The crowd formed a circle, their phones pointed like cameras at a celebrity sighting, but none stepped forward to help. Kneeling beside Mr. Parker, Tommy's hands moved with practiced precision. First, check for breathing, shallow but present. Pulse, rapid and irregular. No response to voice or touch. The signs he'd memorized from his medical books pointed to a heart attack. As he loosened the expensive tie and turned the older man onto his side, he could hear people in the crowd whispering. "Should we let a street kid touch him? Someone should stop him. Where are the real doctors? Isn't that Robert Parker? The real estate guy?" An older woman in scrubs pushed through the crowd. "I'm a nurse," she said, kneeling beside Tommy. She reached for Mr. Parker's wrist, but paused when she saw Tommy had already positioned him correctly in the recovery position. Their eyes met briefly. She recognized him from the hospital cafeteria. "Pulse is irregular," Tommy reported, speaking like a professional. "Breathing shallow, skin clammy. Classic signs of cardiac arrest. No response to stimuli." The nurse's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded in agreement. As if pulled by an invisible thread, Tommy's eyes landed on a photograph that had spilled from the briefcase. He quickly tucked it into his pocket before anyone could notice. Some things weren't meant for the public's prying eyes. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder. Tommy knew he had only moments left. Leaning close to Mr. Parker's ear, he whispered words that would later shake both their worlds. "Your son never made it to room 437 that day. But I know why you still visit every year." The paramedics arrived in a flurry of activity, their equipment beeping and voices sharp with urgency. As they loaded Mr. Parker onto the stretcher, one of them looked at Tommy with surprise. "Kid got everything right," the nurse told them. "Recovery position, initial assessment, textbook perfect." That's when Tommy asked his question about room 437, the one that made everyone freeze. In the chaos that followed, few noticed how the boy's hands trembled, or how his eyes never left Mr. Parker's face. Fewer still saw the tear that rolled down his cheek as the ambulance doors closed. The crowd began to disperse, their morning entertainment over. But Tommy stood rooted to the spot, the photograph burning a hole in his pocket, his grandmother's words echoing in his mind. As the ambulance pulled away, he whispered to himself, "The promise wasn't broken, Mr. Parker. It just took a different path." The emergency room at City General Hospital buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses moved with practiced efficiency around Mr. Parker's bed, their voices calm but urgent. Tommy had followed the ambulance, slipping through the hospital doors unnoticed, a skill he'd perfected over months of visiting the medical library. "BP 160/95, heart rate irregular," called out a young doctor. "Get me his medical history." The staff moved quickly, hooking up monitors and starting in 4. Tommy stood in the corner, making himself small, listening to every word. He knew they'd eventually notice him and throw him out, but he needed to stay just a little longer. An older doctor burst through the doors, his face grave. "Robert Parker? I've been his physician for 20 years. He glanced at the monitors and frowned. "He's been ignoring my warnings about his heart for months." The doctor started rattling off Mr. Parker's medical history, but stopped mid-sentence when he noticed Tommy. "Who let a homeless child in here?" he demanded. But before anyone could move to remove him, Tommy spoke up, his voice steady despite his ragged appearance. His last cardiac check was 3 months ago. The EKG showed early warning signs, but he refused follow-up care. He's been taking medication for high blood pressure, but not consistently. Tommy paused, then added quietly, he visits room 437 every year on March 15th, which always spikes his blood pressure. The room fell silent. The older doctor stared at Tommy, then at his notes, his face paling slightly. "How could you possibly know all that?" Before Tommy could answer, the monitors started beeping frantically. Mr. Parker's heart rate was climbing dangerously. As the medical team rushed to respond, Tommy slipped closer to the bed. In the chaos, he pulled out the photograph he'd taken from the sidewalk and placed it on the bedside table. The picture showed a younger Robert Parker standing in a hospital room, room 437. He was holding a baby, and beside him stood a woman with kind eyes. The same kind eyes that Tommy saw every time he looked at his grandmother's photograph. Hours passed. Tommy remained in his corner, watching, waiting. Nurses gave him curious glances but seemed unwilling to throw him out after his earlier display of medical knowledge. As evening approached, Mr. Parker's condition finally stabilized. "He'll need surgery," the older doctor announced, rubbing his tired eyes. "But he should pull through." He turned to Tommy, who was still there, still watching. "Young man, I think it's time you told us who you really are." Tommy straightened up, reaching into his pocket for his grandmother's worn photograph. As he pulled it out, Mr. Parker's eyes fluttered open. Their gazes met across the room, and Tommy took a deep breath. The truth he'd carried for so long was finally ready to be told. 15 years ago, Tommy began, his young voice steady. "In room 437, you made a promise to a nurse named Mary, my grandmother. A promise about your son, and about another baby boy born that same night." He stepped forward, holding out both photographs side by side. "I'm not here by accident, Mr. Parker. I'm here because some promises don't die, they just wait for the right moment." Mr. Parker stared at the 2 photographs lying on his hospital blanket, his hands trembling as he picked them up. The memories he'd locked away for 15 years came flooding back like a broken dam. The night in room 437 wasn't just another sad chapter in his life, it was the night that changed everything. "Your grandmother," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Mary. She was the head nurse in the maternity ward." His eyes filled with tears as he looked at Tommy. "The night my son was born." Tommy nodded slowly. "Was the same night I was born. Grandmother told me the story 100 times before she died. 2 babies, same night, same room. One born to wealth, one to poverty. But only one survived." His voice caught slightly. "Your son had a heart condition. The doctors said he wouldn't make it through the night." Mr. Parker's monitors beeped faster as the memories surfaced. "Mary, your grandmother, she stayed with me all night. Helen, my wife, was still unconscious from complications. I was alone, watching my son slip away." He touched the old photograph gently. "But there was another baby crying in the next bassinet." "That was me," Tommy said softly. "My mother died during childbirth. No father in the picture. Grandmother was all I had." He stepped closer to the bed. "She told me how you sat there, holding both babies, talking to them all night. And then you made her a promise." The older man closed his eyes, tears rolling down his cheeks. "I promised that if my son didn't make it, I would make sure the other baby, you, would never want for anything. That I'd watch over you from a distance, make sure you had opportunities." His voice broke. "But when my son passed away, I couldn't bear to come back. The pain was too much. I convinced myself it was better to just set up a trust fund and let Mary handle everything. Grandmother used every penny of that money for my education, Tommy explained. She homeschooled me, bought medical books, taught me everything she knew about nursing. She said I had a gift for healing, just like her. He paused, swallowing hard. But then she got sick. The money ran out. She made me promise before she died that I'd find you, remind you of that night. Mr. Parker looked at the young boy standing before him, no longer just a homeless child, but a living connection to his past, to his lost son, to a promise made in grief and forgotten in pain. All these months, you've been watching me, haven't you? Learning my routine, studying medical books so you'd know what to do when. Tommy nodded. Grandmother always said timing was everything in medicine. I knew you were heading for trouble, saw the symptoms getting worse. I just had to be ready. A nurse appeared in the doorway, then stopped, sensing the weight of the moment. Mr. Parker reached out a shaking hand and took Tommy's smaller one in his. Mary must have known, must have seen something that night that I was too blind to see. She raised you to be exactly where you needed to be, exactly when you needed to be there. She said sometimes angels wear rags, Tommy whispered, squeezing the older man's hand. And sometimes they have work to do. The story of the homeless boy who saved the millionaire spread through New York City like wildfire. Newspapers ran headlines, social media buzzed with videos of the incident, but none of them knew the real story unfolding within the walls of City General Hospital. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Parker's hospital room became a place of healing, not just for his heart, but for two broken lives finding their way back to wholeness. Each day, Tommy would arrive early, his medical books tucked under his arm, sitting quietly while doctors made their rounds. The hospital staff had stopped questioning his presence, especially after learning he was the reason one of the city's wealthiest men was alive. Tell me more about your grandmother, Mr. Parker would ask during their long afternoons together. Tommy shared stories of Mary's kindness, her dedication to nursing, and her dreams for his future. Each tale seemed to soften something in the older man's face, bringing back shadows of the person he'd been before grief hardened his heart. One morning, the older doctor who'd been suspicious of Tommy came in to find the boy explaining the latest research on cardiac care to Mr. Parker, complete with detailed drawings. You know, the doctor said, shaking his head in amazement, I've never seen anything quite like it. He has a natural gift for medicine. The change in Mr. Parker became evident to everyone. The Stone Man of New York real estate began to smile, to ask about others, to care about more than just business deals. He made calls from his hospital bed, setting things in motion that would change more than just Tommy's life. The first step was giving Tommy a home, not just any home, but a place in his own penthouse. The dust in those empty rooms has waited long enough for some life, he said. But that was just the beginning. Mr. Parker established a foundation in Mary's name, dedicated to helping homeless children with dreams of medical careers. The media caught wind of the story's deeper meaning, how a nurse's love and foresight had orchestrated a second chance for both a lost millionaire and an orphaned boy. The foundation's launch made headlines, with Tommy standing proudly beside Mr. Parker, both of them wearing suits but Tommy's feet now in proper shoes. Your grandmother, Mr. Parker said one evening as they looked out over the city from his penthouse window, she knew exactly what she was doing, didn't she? Training you in medicine, teaching you to watch for symptoms, making sure you'd be ready when the time came. Tommy nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. She said everyone deserves a second chance at family. Even those who think they've lost their way. The doctors at City General Hospital started noticing something else too. Mr. Parker began visiting other patients, particularly those in room 437. He and Tommy would bring books, toys, and most importantly, hope. The room that had once held so much pain became a place of new beginnings. As spring turned to summer, the sight of the millionaire and his young protégé became familiar around the hospital. Tommy, now enrolled in the city's best school but still spending every free moment studying medicine, would explain complex procedures to Mr. Parker, who listened with the pride of a grandfather. "You know," Mr. Parker said one day, watching Tommy help a young patient, "some might call it chance that you were there that morning on Fifth Avenue. But I think Mary had it planned all along. She knew that sometimes the best medicine for a broken heart isn't in any medical book." 5 years passed since that fateful morning on Fifth Avenue. The day Tommy graduated as the youngest student from his prestigious medical high school program, the auditorium was packed. In the front row sat Mr. Parker, now healthier and happier than he'd been in decades, beaming with pride. "Life has a way of coming full circle," Tommy began his valedictorian speech, his voice confident yet humble. "5 years ago, I was a homeless boy with nothing but medical books from a dumpster and a promise to keep. Today, I stand here because 2 people believed in second chances, my grandmother Mary, and a man who had forgotten that sometimes the richest gifts come in the most unexpected packages." The Mary Grace Foundation, named after Tommy's grandmother, had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a simple idea to help homeless children with medical dreams had expanded into a nationwide program. Dozens of young students, once living on the streets, were now on their paths to becoming doctors, nurses, and medical researchers. The homeless boy who once watched life from the shadows had become a beacon of hope for others. The millionaire who had locked his heart away behind wealth and success had found something money could never buy, a second chance at family. As they stood together on the hospital roof that evening, watching the sunset over the city they'd both called home, Tommy pulled out 2 worn photographs from his wallet, the same ones that had brought them together that day on Fifth Avenue. "Grandmother always said angels wear rags," Tommy smiled, "but she never mentioned they sometimes wear expensive suits too." Mr. Parker laughed, putting his arm around the young man's shoulders. "Your grandmother was the real angel, Tommy. She knew that true healing doesn't always come in the form of medicine. Sometimes it comes in the form of a second chance, a kept promise, and the courage to open our hearts again." The story of the homeless boy and the millionaire became more than just a viral moment or a newspaper headline. It became a reminder that in a world often divided by wealth and status, the most valuable things, love, compassion, and the chance to make a difference, cost nothing at all. And somewhere, they both knew, Mary was smiling, her work finally complete.